When you walk through a museum, there is this sort of strange phenomenon you start to notice if you pay close enough attention.
Oh, definitely.
Like you'll look at one realistic painting and it just looks, well, incredibly flat. It's an image sitting on a canvas, but then you step in front of another piece and it feels entirely different.
Right. It almost looks completely three-dimensional.
Exactly, as if it holds some kind of inner light. So, to understand how an artist physically traps light like that on a flat surface, we're doing a deep dive today into the process of artist Laura Palacios.
Yeah, and the sources we're examining break down her masterclass on painting an acrylic rose covered in morning dew.
And it really is a masterclass, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
In the truest sense, because the goal today isn't simply to, replicate her brushstrokes or just describe what she's doing. It is about understanding how a painter thinks.
How they actually observe the world.
Right. We're looking at how a painter analyzes light and then reconstructs that optical environment layer by layer. The difference between a flat painting and a luminous one usually comes down to whether the artist is painting the surface of objects or painting the light itself.
Which is wild to think about. Going through her process, I realized my entire mental model of painting was just backward.
How so?
Well, I think most of us imagine painting kind of like a color printer.
Oh, yeah, the printer analogy.
Right. You look at a rose, you see a specific pinkish red, you mix that exact final color on your palette, and you just slap it onto the canvas.
Which is what a lot of beginners do.
But what Palacios is doing here is much closer to building like a stained glass window.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. And it brings us to the foundational concept of her entire process, which is veladuras.
Veladuras, right? Or glazing.
Exactly, glazing. The core principle of glazing is that the final colors you perceive on the canvas are not created by physically mixing opaque paints on a wooden palette.
Wait, really? So she isn't mixing the final color at all?
No, she's relying on optical mixing. She applies the paint in incredibly thin, transparent layers. So the light enters the painting, travels through those translucent layers of pigment, hits a reflective base underneath, and then bounces back out.
Oh, wow. So the color is ultimately constructed inside the viewer's own eye.
Precisely. You are the one mixing the color in your head.
So if we're building a stained glass window, you obviously need a light source shining from behind it, right, to illuminate the glass.
Right.
But on a dark, opaque canvas, that light source has to be fabricated. And Palacios does this right at the very beginning, before she even sketches the flower.
Yeah, she takes a sponge and applies a mix of yellow and cream acrylic over the entire canvas.
Which seems so weird if you're painting a red rose.
It does, but she is establishing her light source. By laying down that homogeneous, perfectly flat, opaque layer of yellow cream, she is creating a reflective underlying tone.
And she's super strict about it too. I noticed she even scrapes the excess paint off her palette before loading the sponge.
Yeah, she does that to ensure there are absolutely no physical bumps or textures on the canvas.
Right, because any physical texture at this stage would create like microscopic shadows, right?
Exactly. Microscopic shadows that would interrupt the light bouncing back later. That smooth yellow layer establishes the visual DNA of the entire piece.
Visual DNA, I like that.
It unifies the composition. Later in the process, whether she's applying a cool gray or vibrant red, all of those transparent layers will share this warm, underlying universe.
So the light will always carry a hint of that initial yellow back to the viewer.
Yes, but establishing this base requires absolute discipline regarding the medium itself.
Right, because time becomes an active ingredient here. The sources make a point of noting that she has to let this yellow base dry completely.
Which is crucial with acrylics.
Yeah, because acrylic paint consists of pigment suspended in a polymer emulsion. When it's wet, it's vulnerable.
Very vulnerable.
If she were to start painting her subsequent layers while that base was even slightly damp, the brush would physically lift the yellow pigment, mixing it directly with the new colors.
And that physical mixing would completely destroy the transparency. You would end up with muddy, opaque paint instead of a luminous glaze.
Muddy paint is the worst.
It is. But once that base is completely locked in and dry, she can move on to the architecture of the subject.
Yeah, and I was looking at how she maps out this architecture, and it's striking how minimal it is.
Very minimal.
I mean, she doesn't draw the delicate veins on the petals. She doesn't outline a single drop of water. The drawing is just like large geometric masses and structural directions.
Yeah, because geometry must always precede finish. You cannot ask what texture a surface has until you know exactly where that surface exists in space.
That makes total sense.
If a painter doesn't understand the underlying architecture of a petal, like how it bends away from the light or where it overlaps another form, then rendering a highly detailed water droplet on top of it is entirely useless.
All right, the foundation has to be secure first.
Exactly. The structural foundation must be secure before anything else happens.
And that structural buildup leads to a technique that I found, honestly, incredibly counterintuitive.
The shadows.
Yes, because we are taught from kindergarten that if you want to paint a shadow, you reach for the black paint.
Naturally. Yeah.
But Palacio starts building the deep volume of the rose using just one single color, oxide red.
It's a very earthy, muted red.
Right, and she dilutes it heavily with water and acrylic medium and just starts depositing these transparent layers.
She applies one layer, lets it dry, observes the shift in value, and then applies another layer over the deepest areas.
Wait, so she is literally just stacking the same watery red over and over again to create the shadows?
Yes. She isn't mixing white paint for the highlights or black paint for the depths.
That's crazy.
She is creating volume by systematically deciding how much light to let escape from that bottom yellow layer.
It's like putting on multiple pairs of sunglasses to make the world look darker.
That's a great way to put it. It fundamentally changes how we think about darkness in a painting.
So the first subtle layer of oxide red goes down, acting like a faint filter over the yellow light source.
Right, it slightly shifts the value. Then the second layer on top of it creates a thicker barrier, absorbing more of the light before it can bounce back to the viewer.
And the third layer absorbs even more.
Exactly. In a direct, opaque painting technique, the artist just paints a flat, dark spot. But in this method, the darkness has literal physical depth.
Because you are looking through strata of pigment.
Yes, the volume is born from the accumulation of layers, not a change in the paint tube.
Wow. But I did notice at this stage the painting starts looking quite bleak and heavy.
It does. It gets very monolithic.
Right, we have the volume, but it feels monolithic. So to make it feel atmospheric, the sources note she introduces a shift in temperature.
This is a huge step.
She brings in burnt umber, a warm, earthy brown, to deepen the darkest crevices. But then, and this surprised me, she introduces Payne's gray.
Which is a deeply cold, almost bluish gray.
Right. Why bring in a cold gray?
Introducing that cold dark over the warm red and brown layers is a critical pivot in her process. It introduces thermal opposition.
Thermal opposition, so like the contrast between warm and cool colors.
Exactly. Think about how shadows operate in the physical world. A shadow is almost never a pure black void.
True.
It is a space that is simply receiving less direct light. But it still receives ambient light reflecting off the surrounding environment. And often, it receives the cool, scattered light from the sky itself.
Oh, I see.
So by glazing a cold, transparent gray over a warm, earthy red, Palacios gives the shadow chromatic life. It stops being a dead zone on the canvas and becomes a breathable, atmospheric space.
That's fascinating. And while she is carving out these deep, cool shadows, something really interesting happens with the dewdrops.
Ah, yes. The water.
You can see them starting to emerge on the petals, but she still hasn't painted a single drop of water.
Not a single drop.
She hasn't touched the white paint. It's like carving a sculpture out of negative space. She is carefully painting the shadows, the edges, and the dark cavities of the petal around the space where the water will eventually sit.
Because she is relying on the viewer's understanding of transparency.
What do you mean?
Well, a drop of water is, by nature, clear. We only perceive it because it distorts the surface beneath it and casts subtle shadows.
Right, it doesn't really have its own color.
Exactly. Palacios understands that form often becomes visible solely through the contrast surrounding it. She isn't painting the object itself, she is painting the environmental context that will force your brain to assume the object is there.
So at this stage, the structural architecture is built. We have the geometry, we have the physical depth of the shadows, and we have this beautiful thermal opposition between the warm reds and the cool grays.
And it's only now that she awakens the true, vibrant color.
Finally, she introduces vermilion, right? A highly saturated bright red, along with chrome green for the stems.
Yes. And again, she applies them as heavily diluted glazes over the entire rose.
Which seems risky, but notice how this sequence of events protects the color.
Completely. Up until now, the painting was structural and somewhat muted. The oxide red and the browns were doing the heavy lifting of building the three-dimensional form.
So when she finally glazes that vibrant vermilion over the top, the pure color adapts to a structure that already exists.
The vermilion doesn't have to work to describe the shadows. because the shadows are already sitting underneath it, doing their job.
The color is just free to simply be color.
Yes, it reinforces the chromatic identity of the rose without having to carry the burden of the drawing or the volume. It makes the entire form vibrate.
It really does. But right after she makes the rose vibrate with this brilliant vermilion, she does something weird. She goes back to darkening it.
Yeah, she brings the Payne's gray and the brown right back in.
To deepen the shadows again. Reviewing the footage, it looks almost inefficient. I mean, she moves toward the light, then pushes back into the dark, adds bright color, and then darkens it again. Why not just get the darks right the first time?
It feels like a step backward, for sure, but it reveals the core philosophy of a master painter. A painting is an ecosystem.
An ecosystem.
Yeah, no color or value exists in isolation. Every time you introduce a new element, like glazing that highly saturated vermilion, it alters the balance of the entire canvas.
Oh, so the bright red suddenly makes the initial shadows look too weak.
Exactly, they look too shallow. So she is forced to respond. She has to reevaluate the depths and push them further back to support the new brighter light.
So there is no straight line to a finished piece.
Never. It is a permanent, evolving negotiation between the lights, the midtones, and the shadows.
And that permanent negotiation leads to a really dramatic intervention in the background.
The black background.
Yeah. Up until this point, the rose has been floating on whatever was left of that initial yellow cream base. But now, she takes a sponge and applies Payne's gray to the entire background.
Completely surrounding the rose in a deep, cold darkness.
And we immediately witness the power of simultaneous contrast.
It's magical.
It really is. The moment that background goes dark, the rose looks incredibly luminous. It looks like someone just flipped a switch and turned a spotlight on the petals.
But she hasn't added a single drop of white paint to the flower itself.
Not a single drop. How does that work?
Well, she didn't alter the light on the rose. She altered the environment surrounding the light. Simultaneous contrast is a biological quirk of our visual perception.
Meaning our eyes are basically tricking us.
Pretty much. Our visual cortex does not measure absolute light or absolute color. It measures relationships.
Okay.
A color's perceived value and brightness depend entirely on the visual data situated directly next to it.
So by creating a dark, cool void behind the flower, she manipulates the viewer's eye into interpreting the red petals as vastly brighter than they actually are.
Exactly. The petals are optically pushed forward, out of the canvas. The background is not merely empty space, it is an active mechanism in the painting's optical engine.
Wow. So with the background pushing the rose forward, the shadows carved deep, and the red vibrating, she is finally ready to introduce the highlights.
Ah, white paint.
She brings out the white paint, but she doesn't just grab pure white out of the tube, she mixes a warm white.
Combining titanium white with a small amount of yellow ochre.
And true to form, she dilutes it, applying it as a thin, transparent glaze.
By using a transparent warm white, she is recontextualizing the entire value scale of the painting.
How so?
Think back to that very first step, the flat yellow cream base.
Right.
For the majority of the process, that base served as the brightest light source in the painting. But by introducing these new, brighter, warm highlights, she effectively turns that original base layer into a midtone.
Oh, I see. It becomes the bridge.
Yeah.
It sits directly between the deep, cool shadows of the Payne's gray and the new, warm highlights.
It creates a seamless transition of light across the form.
And this warm white is also what she uses to finally detail the dewdrops.
This part is so cool.
The anatomical breakdown she does of how to paint a drop of water is fascinating. She doesn't just paint a white circle. She treats the tiny drop of water as its own complex optical system.
She breaks it down into distinct zones.
Right. There's a dark zone to give the drop volume, a transition area, and an area of optical deformation.
That optical deformation is key. A drop of water acts as a tiny spherical lens. It magnifies and warps whatever sits directly underneath it.
So she carefully paints the distorted red veins of the petal inside the drop itself.
Exactly.
And then finally, she adds a small, sharp reflection of the ambient light in the room. She provides the brain with these very specific microscopic cues.
The shadow, the lens distortion, the reflection.
And our brain takes those cues and synthesizes the illusion of liquid.
If she had simply painted a solid white dot, the brain would reject it as a piece of opaque plastic sitting on a leaf.
It wouldn't look wet at all.
No. The illusion of transparency requires visual evidence of what lies beneath and behind the object.
So, after all of this careful layering, she reaches the final step. Step 12 in our source material.
The ultimate secret.
This is where she brings out the pure, unmixed, thick titanium white.
And this is the most dangerous tool on her palette.
Yeah.
There's a very specific reason she hoards it until the final moments of the painting.
Why is it dangerous?
Pure titanium white is fiercely opaque and intensely luminous. If she had used it early in the process, or if she used it to paint every single light area on the petals, it would have flattened the entire image.
Because it would destroy the hierarchy of light.
Exactly that. Luminosity requires a strict hierarchy. If every surface is blasted with maximum illumination, then the light loses its power. It becomes visual noise.
It's the visual equivalent of like a room full of people screaming at the top of their lungs.
That's a great analogy.
When everyone is shouting, you can't distinguish a single voice. It just becomes a wall of static.
Right.
By keeping the entire painting relatively muted, built on those transparent, negotiated midtones, that final, tiny dot of pure, opaque white acts like a whisper in a completely silent room.
A whisper that demands all of your attention.
It cuts through everything else. She reserves this pure white for the most specific microscopic interventions.
The absolute crisp edge of a single dewdrop.
Or one sharp gleam on the highest ridge of a petal bending toward the sun.
These tiny dots become the maximum values of the entire work.
So she isn't using the pure white to paint an object. She's using it to physically hijack the viewer's optic nerve and direct their eye exactly where she wants it to rest.
It's brilliant, and when you pull back from that final brilliant dot of white and look at the completed masterpiece, the core mystery of the painting reveals itself.
Why does it hold that inner light?
Because that initial yellow base never disappeared.
It's still there.
Yes. When you look at the final image, your conscious mind sees red petals, deep brown folds, cold gray backgrounds, and bright water droplets. But underneath the reds, underneath the browns, underneath the grays, that yellow cream layer is still sitting there.
It is silently powering the painting from beneath, catching the light from the room and reflecting it back through the strata of Velodorus.
The true power of Laura Palacio's technique isn't found in a frantic obsession with microscopic detail. It is an exercise in profound restraint.
Restraint.
It is about carefully dictating, layer by transparent layer, what the viewer is explicitly allowed to see and what they are forced to imagine.
She provides the thermal opposition, the structural geometry, and the shifting values. The viewer's brain supplies the reality of the rose.
She doesn't make water, she paints the conditions necessary for water to exist.
It completely reframes the act of observation. You realize that a masterwork is less about the application of paint and more about the orchestration of human perception.
It really changes how you look at art.
It changes how you engage with the visual world entirely. So, here is something for you to mull over after this deep dive. The next time you look at a drop of rain resting on a leaf, or honestly, even as you look at the screen of your smartphone or computer right now, consider this.
Oh, this is good.
The optical illusion of forcing the human brain to mix light, construct reality, and perceive depth out of adjacent glowing layers is the exact same foundational science used to design the digital pixels you stare at every day.
Wow.
The master painters just figured out the biology of human perception 500 years earlier, using nothing but crushed rocks, oil, and a profound understanding of light.